Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Victor Ruthig, and I'll be moderating today's session on making a decision about an academic faculty track. And our speakers will be Dr. Stephanie Kozakis from the University of Minnesota, Dr. Raymond Lucas from the George Washington School of Medicine, and Dr. Alvaro Perez from the Central Caribbean School of Medicine. For those joining us virtually, please feel free to ask questions via the chat. Questions will be answered after the presentation part of today's session during the open period. And if anybody is having troubles hearing, let me know if you're virtual in the chat box also, and I'll get to AV. With that, I'm going to go ahead and progress to the first slide. Just to remind you that the learning objectives for today are to be able to describe and differentiate common academic faculty tracks, review considerations when selecting a track for your academic career, and discussing factors that may influence a decision to switch tracks. With that, I'm going to progress to a slide that Dr. Lucas will read.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to meet you virtually. My name is Ray Lucas. I'm at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Victor asked us also when we first introduced ourselves to give a...
I think only the virtual.
Okay. So my name is Ray Lucas. I'm from George Washington University. Before I start, a little bit about my journey. I was actually not out when I started my career in academic medicine. Came out at the age of 35 when I was already a faculty member, but have been through several leadership roles here, including program director, vice chair, and then a senior associate dean. And I would say the impact of being a gay administrator and physician, you know, it's really made me help in all of my roles be a much more inclusive person, you know, for everyone here at my school. So I don't know how well this might work with our hybrid environment, but before I start, I thought I'd like to hear from some folks in the audience, either in the room or participants that are virtual. You know, what are your thoughts about faculty tracks? What does a faculty track mean to you? And what kind of questions do you have before we start? Because we've prepared this presentation, but we clearly want to answer your questions. And if you're virtual, I think maybe you could put it in the chat, or if you're in the room, if we can't hear you, perhaps Victor or Alvaro can help restate the questions if needed.
Yes, I'll be happy to restate questions from the room and also monitor the chat, Dr. Lucas. There's no activity in the chat, so I don't know if anybody in the audience has any outstanding thoughts in relation to. Okay, so there is one question in the chat, and this is the idea of how do you decide between a clinical only track and a clinical educator track?
Great question, and that question will definitely be answered in today's presentation. So I'm not going to give you the answer now.
And then I have is I'm actually will be joining faculty at HWC soon. And the way that they do academic faculty tracks is very much like publication based, and it seems as though your efforts in like education and advocacy outside of research have less weight in what you do. So
this is a question or a thought related to the weighting of the different pillars that make up progressing along faculty track and how they might be different based on the track you pick or the institution even where you end up.
Great. Another great question. I think one I commonly heard when I was a faculty affairs dean. You know, it has to do around things such as distribution of effort and other things. Again, something else we're prepared to cover today.
And not really, I'm not seeing any other questions. Anybody?
All right. So let's move on to the next slide. So we're all on the same page about tracks. I think that we need to first ask ourselves the question, what is a faculty track? And as you're going to learn today, there are really many components to a faculty member's job. It's nearly impossible for every faculty member to do everything involved in an academic medical career. And so by focusing faculty jobs onto certain activities, the institution can ensure that its missions are being met. And then the faculty member has the opportunity to take a position that really aligns with their sort of skills and their interests. So with that, a faculty track, it's a career path where there's actually a designation of what your faculty responsibilities are. And equally, if not more important, the type of criteria that will be used for you when you go up for academic promotion. Next slide, please. So this is a table from this study in academic medicine in 2011. There was a survey study of faculty academic tracks in US medical schools. And I put this up here really to drive home the point that you do have options when you join academia. And if you look at this graph, you can see that most schools have multiple possible career tracks for medical school faculty, many of them with 3 and 4, and some with even more. And so we're going to talk today about what these tracks are and what they mean to you. Next slide. So here are some common tracks that you see at medical schools. Dr. Terazakis is going to talk more in depth about what types of activities and job responsibilities you might have in these tracks. But it's just in reading the names of them, you can see that they tend to focus around sort of the core mission areas in a medical school, education, clinical service, and research. Some schools even have more innovative tracks, such as an administrative track or a track for people whose career is on QA or quality assurance and advocacy and others. I think each of us on the panel will give a quick little description of what the track landscape is in our own institution, just so you have a sense of that. But educator, researcher, clinical scientist, clinical educator, combinations of clinical service, research, and teaching is what you'll see. At my institution, we're one of the outlier schools. We actually only have 2 tracks, a tenure track and a non-tenure track, and we're going to talk about tenure later. But at my school, if you're in a tenure track, you have obligations and have to demonstrate excellence in all 3 of the core mission areas, teaching, research, and service, with a high emphasis on research, that you're an independent investigator with funding. And if you're in the non-tenure track at my school, the requirements are you pick 2 of the 3 areas for your excellence areas, so you can kind of design your own track between teaching, service, and scholarship, such as becoming a clinician educator. So Stephanie and Alvaro, you want to give a quick overview of the kind of tracks you have at your school?
Stephanie, would you like, or Dr. Terazakis, would you like to go first?
Sure. So hello, everyone virtually in the room. I'm Stephanie Terazakis. I'm chair of the Department of Radiation Oncology at University of Minnesota and a professor there. And I've held sort of leadership roles in the 3 different pillars. I was residency program director at Hopkins, then I was director of clinical operations there, and then I came to Minnesota as vice chair of research. And so it's been interesting to sort of see the emphasis on how productivity is defined by each of those 3 pillars. So we have similarly a tenure and non-tenure track at University of Minnesota. And the tenure track is kind of the, again, more traditional academic track where you similarly have to have independent funding to be promoted along that track. And we have a tenure clock as well, which I think I talk about in one of the slides, a little bit about that. And then on the non-tenure track, similarly, we have different kind of emphasis or focus, foci that you can have. You can be a clinician scholar, which is the more academic track, but not requiring really independent funding. You could be more of an educator, or a new track that we actually just developed in the last couple of years was the master clinician track, which would be really defined as developing a national reputation in clinical service, clinical program builder, not necessarily the same kind of criteria for publication and national talks that we would have on a clinician scholar track. And then we of course have the non-faculty option as well. And a lot of the conversations I have with folks are, should they be in the non-faculty group, really truly just clinician, or should they be a master clinician faculty member? And in trying to figure out the pros and cons of those approaches. So that's kind of a broad overview of what we have in Minnesota.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Álvaro Pérez. I'm from Universidad Central del Caribe, UCC in Puerto Rico. I'm an assistant dean for curriculum development, accreditation and licensing. I'm an associate professor in the pharmacology department of the School of Medicine. And in my institution, we don't have tenure tracks. All people are in a non-tenure track. But we have most of the tracks that you are seeing in this slide. And all of them are in my institution. And I think the tracking as administrator could be one interesting, which is my track right now. So I have the most of my academic load related to my administrative role as a dean. So if in my institution, if you are a dean or a department director or program director, you will be assigned to a faculty track as administrator, where you have the most, your more responsibility, the most time you devoted to in your responsibilities is to the administration. And also you can have combinations. You can be an administrator and educator if you divide it depending on the percentage of time devoted to each one of these. Thank you.
Thank you. Speakers. So we're Dr. Lucas, I think Dr. Terzakis here. This is your section now.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you've all heard a little bit of us kind of talking about these three pillars and kind of thinking about ways in which they combine to try to define your track. And, I think we think of it as sort of that tripartite mission, the research, teaching, and service, often being kind of clinical service or, service to the university. And so trying to figure out, where your personal career lies in terms of kind of the proportion of time that you want to spend in each of these domains, I think will help you figure out, what's the emphasis and what track might be the best for you. We can go to the next slide. So taking service, as a first start, and we're going to break down, each of these pillars. So what counts as service? Again, we think of clinical service as kind of the big one, involving your direct patient care, and things that would sort of count towards clinical service are, excellence in patient care. You're supervising trainees in your clinical setting, residents, learners. You're involved in community activities that are perhaps health-based community activities. You serve as a course or a clerkship director within the medical school. That's something that's often seen as service to the medical school and also counts as part of your clinical service and in education as well. Again, you'll see some of these overlap. There are a lot of roles. As you're a clerkship director, you're scheduling the rotations, you're administering exams, you're grading, you may be reporting and evaluating, your learners, and you're, keeping up to date the learning management systems, which are now really the evaluation systems, and our evaluation tools, within the universities are becoming more and more complex and important in terms of trying to gather data on teaching. And then lastly, kind of administrative service. I think this is one that is always a little bit of a gray area because a lot of times you don't get compensated for administrative service. So how can you use administrative service to help to your advantage? And that's towards promotion. So if you're, on committees, national committees, guidelines committees are a frequent one that really count towards showing national recognition, that you are a clinician, that it's defining the standard of care on a practice guideline, or, within your national organization, leading a committee, or again, contributing back to your field. Quality improvement activities is another one that's really being seen, I think, by universities now as being very important, patient safety and quality. And so being part of that either within the clinical setting or again, nationally. And of course, other kind of administrative roles like a division director or a program director. And of course, if you have a dean's role, like an assistant dean. So those kinds of things don't necessarily qualify to get compensation. Some of them do. And I would argue if you're serving in a leadership role, you should always try to get qualified to get your time covered. But, at least they do also contribute and demonstrate your validity towards promotion. Next slide. So how do you kind of prove service outcomes or document them? When you go up, obviously, for promotion, you have to demonstrate things on paper. And so you really want to keep track of everything that you do towards this goal and keep, I always recommend updating your CV every, 6 months at minimum. Quarterly is even more ideal to make sure you don't forget the things that you've done and how you've contributed. But from a clinical service standpoint, if you have any demonstration that you're regionally or nationally known in your field, that leads to patient referrals that are perhaps outside your immediate hospital area. So you get external referrals. That was something that I saw actually at Hopkins. Folks would show that they would pull nationally or internationally in terms of their patient referrals to show that they are an expert in their field. Again, you direct a clinic, you're a division director, you direct a clinical service line. Those are all examples of leadership in that domain. You have successful patient outcomes. You've gotten clinical awards. I've seen, for example, at University of Minnesota, if you've been named, a top doctor in our, Minneapolis St. Paul magazine or a rising star, those are things that are considered to be clinical awards and again, recognition of your success. Developing, publishing clinical care pathways, both within the institution or, in publication format. So that may not be necessarily a research study, but again, you're part of a guidelines committee or you have a clinical care pathway that is now published and people can follow it. And then lastly, again, quality improvement activities, safety related that are either internal or publications. Next slide.
This is, switching, and this is Dr. Perez.
Okay. Yes, and continuing with these three pillars that compose the role of or the components of each one of the tracks, research is one of the most important or another important pillar. Usually or traditionally, we define research, those related mainly to the bench research. But recently, the research has been evolving to include clinical research, translational research, and lately, community research and educational research, which I want to emphasize because this is new in this field. In our classroom or in our teaching at the bedside, we can do some educational research that can be published and you can be funded to do that kind of research. And this can be counted as part of your promotion. So research is not only at the bench or at the translational research, but there are some new fields that are evolving. And related to teaching, this is the biggest component of our role as a faculty. Teaching could include many activities that we usually do in the hospital or in the classroom. You can see some examples of different activities that we do every day in our hospital when we are teaching students, bedside teaching, grand rounds, morbidity and mortality conference, resident core conference, chief of service, journal clubs, residence teachers, board review, simulation, wellness curriculum, mentoring, tutoring. Those are activities that count as teaching, as part of your role in teaching. And when you're when we are talking about teaching in the classroom, is the what come to mind is when we talk about teaching, we think in the lectures and a small group discussion. This is some of examples of what we do in the classroom, but we can do many other things like PBLs, TBLs, and many other strategies, including participation as clinicians in vertical integration. When we give lectures in physiology courses, when we are trying to do some clinical relevance to some topics, we are doing some vertical integration of knowledge. That kind of experiences are part of the classroom activities. And also, there are some other activities that count as teaching that are related to assessment, creating rubrics, creating a test, developing new curriculum to be included in the program, or creating new courses or new programs that are also activities that counts as teaching. And how can we demonstrate that we are doing something in research and teaching? We can summarize those in what counts as a scholarship. A scholarship is the production, the peer review publication of our results. In our classroom, we can do educational research, so we can create a scholarship about that, and in our clinical practice also, and at the bench. So for what counts, what are the evidence that we are doing great or good in research and teaching? If we have publications in peer review journals, like I give these two examples, Academic Medicine and Med Portal, because I'm trying to emphasize the educational research component. So these are publications where you can publish not only the results of your research, but in Med Portal, you can publish, and it's a peer review journal where you can publish your methods, your tools for teaching and assessment. So you don't need to demonstrate, to have results. You just publish how are you doing your work in the classroom or in your teaching strategies. If you are a member of professional societies, if you have been invited as a speaker locally or nationally or internationally, that counts as a scholarship. If you make some editorials for some journals, or you are part of writing one of the books. And the most important, when you register patents of discoveries, this is the highest value of a demonstration of a scholarship. There are, as you can see now, you have different evidence, different ways that you can evidence your productivity in teaching and research and in service, as Stephanie mentioned before. At this moment, we want to try to discuss case one. And Victor, can you help me?
So for case one, Mike is finishing his residency training and he wants to apply for a family medicine faculty position in an academic medical center so we can continue doing clinical research, teaching medical students and residents, and provide healthcare services to the community. He attends a residency program in California that has family in Texas and desires to work close to his family. His ambition is to become a president of an academic healthcare center in the middle term of his life to promote access to medical education to URIM and provide healthcare to marginal communities. At this point in his life, which could be the best faculty track to start his academic career? What resources can he use to narrow his?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Thank you, Victor. Yes. So I want to ask you if you have a minute to think about this situation. Many of you have been in this position in your life. And at this moment, what can Mike use to make the best decision? Which track is best for him right now? Do you know any resources? What do you think is the best for him right now? If any comments or...
And for those of you who are virtual, again, feel free to use the chat box as you take a little bit of time to kind of reflect on this first
Okay.
case study. And then for those of you who are physically here, just feel free to raise your hand if you have thoughts.
I would like to know more about his personal interest, more like a mission that is like patient care, or is it somebody that really enjoys teaching, that's his main passion? And I think that's sorry.
From the script that we have right here, he have equivalent interest in teaching and care and providing healthcare and administration. It's like kind of a he want to be the president, so he need to cover all. I'm trying to answer as Mike. But I think, as you mentioned, right now, if there is no any comment.
No.
Okay. I think for Mike right now, he needs, as you mentioned in your comment, he need to define which is his priorities, which is most important for him. So I think the most valuable resource right now is self-assessment. Is self-assessment and talk to other people, to mentors, to family, to other peers. So right now he needs to do some research about himself and about the other people's things about that. So that's the first step when we are trying to select, to pick a track, is be certain what we want. We want to be focused on clinical service, or we want to be more into administration or into teaching. So that will help you to pick the right track to start, because he's starting his career as an academician. He can change in time. We can change. And tracks are very, very flexible, but with a long-term goal to become a president, he needs to be certain for every step he's going to be doing right now, because it's a high top ambition for him. And what faculty track characteristics would you advise him to focus on? And until now, we have been talking that the tracks are composed by 3 pillars: teaching, service, and research. Which of them would be the most will you be telling Mike that be focused on a strength, though? Which one of those pillars do you consider is more important for Mike right now? A track?
Yeah.
I would say this position of becoming a president, there's going to be a lot of administrative service
Right.
involved in that, but I have a feeling that actually the clinical research is going to be important to highlight him as someone who's like a star in the field, or someone who's brought in a lot of money to the institution. So I think, ironically, it might not actually be service that is the highlight. Probably.
Yeah, you're right.
Repeat that before you.
Okay.
For those of you who are virtual, that was a comment that with the long-term goal of being president of an institution, that probably the biggest thing to focus on initially would be the clinical research component to ensure that you're bringing money to the institution and bringing notoriety to the work that you're doing.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you. Yes, right now, if his ambition to become a president of an academic health center, he need to develop his administrative skills. So, and he must be focused on a track with administrative component, with a high administrative component. So he can start with directing a clinic or start directing projects, and then he can move to more leadership position with more responsibilities. I think we can go.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay. We're bouncing back to you, Dr. Lucas.
Great, thank you. So as what you've heard so far in this presentation, there's different combinations of faculty roles that will make up your track, and we've tried to give you a flavor of the kind of actual activities that you would be responsible for doing, in those various roles. And so, as Dr. Perez said, the first step really in choosing a track for yourself is some self-assessment or self-reflection. And so this grid that you see here is one that you might use to help you in that process. And I think to help you do this, that you would start asking yourself some questions like, why am I going into academic medicine? And why did I want to become a doctor? Do I have a spouse and do I have a family? And, are there career things that are important to me to sort of balance that with my professional life? And how important is location, and how important is salary? Like, these are a lot of questions you can ask yourself to really determine how you would fill out this grid. An example might be that, my passion is providing care to patients with HIV. My interest may be a little bit in teaching, and my value is sort of around, equity in healthcare and equity in life. I might choose a track that's really sort of a clinician educator, where a lot of it is focused on clinical practice of HIV patients, but I get the opportunity to teach medical students and residents in that role, and empower the next generation of doctors with sort of the same passions that I have. So I'm going to pause for like 30 seconds or so just to have everybody look at this table. I'm not going to ask people to sort of like shout out and give what it is for you, but maybe jot down and think in your head, what are your passions, both in your personal and professional life? What are your interests and values? And are there any must-haves? Location, salary sometimes are things in that category. Great, let's move on. And so after you do some self-reflection from looking in, the next step is to really look out and look at what the possibilities are for a track, and sort of match them up to what your interests and values and passions are. And hopefully you can find something that is a match for you. So if a must-have is that I have to live in Seattle because that's where my family is, there's only one medical school in Seattle. So you got to look at what they have there and match something up to like what they have in Seattle. So that's an example of how a must-have may not give you exactly what you want, but it may help clarify your choices. And like I said, if your passions are around certain things, such as patient care or teaching, or you really have a passion for research, those are the things that are going to really drive you to pick your track. We all want to eventually have a position in life where if your work is also your passion, then it's not really work. It's really meaning to your life. And if you can sort of match those things up, you found the sweet spot for yourself and picking the right track for your academic career. Next slide.
I don't know if you wanted to cover
Okay.
part of this first in terms of the priorities.
Okay, so after you feel the first step, the self-assessment that Ray have mentioned, you can try to mix the results of that self-assessment with the assessment of the tracks that is offered in your institution, and you pick and select which are you label each one of them, which are non-negotiable for potentially negotiable or negotiable, and then you can state at the end of when you fill in all of these cells, you can see which is the best track for you. So you can start negotiating with your institution if you find one of the tracks that could be fit to your personal interest and professional interest. So this grid is to help you summarize all the data from your self-assessment and the data available from your institution from the different tracks to help you make the right decision. Since there are some of these features that will be negotiable, not only negotiable for you, but in each one of the tracks are related for percentage of time devoted. So you can negotiate with your department director, how can you move the percentage of education and research to finally decide which one of the tracks are best for you.
Dr. Lucas, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No.
We're back to you, Dr. Terazakis.
So I think we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about, sort of a next choice, which is, would you choose a tenure track or a non-tenure track? And that's something that, you have to think about, especially if you're going down a research pathway. Next slide. So, what is meant by tenure? Tenure is typically a permanent, quote unquote, faculty appointment. And so, tenured faculty usually can't be terminated unless under really extreme circumstances. I would not call, in today's day and age, just a carte blanche. I mean, I still think that, you need to follow certain professionalism code of conduct. But generally speaking, tenured faculty, can't be fired, basically. And especially, historically, it gave people a little bit more license to be able to go into controversial topics without fear of losing their jobs. Again, I think that is a debatable situation, I think in our current state of the world. But regardless, I mean, if you're tenured and you're going along the tenured pathway to become tenured, you really need to be focused on research, strong record of publication in high impact journals, high H-index, external grant funding that shows you're an independent researcher that's sustained, and then national recognition in your field. And those are typically kind of the highlights and criteria to achieve tenure in most places. And then typically there's a tenure clock. And so there's a number of years you get to kind of achieve that bar. It's typically around 7 years. We actually have a 9-year clock. But, if you're coming in, for example, from another institution at a certain rank, you might have already eaten up a few years of that clock. And so you really have to kind of know the specifics of the institution and explore that. And particularly relevant if you're moving institutions and you were, on tenure track in one institution and want to continue that in another institution. Next slide. So very important, I think, for everything we're talking about today, not just the tenure, question, but you really have to know your local requirements. Every school has a set of objective criteria for promotion. There's usually a handbook of some sort. And, sometimes there's also department specific criteria that go along with the university handbook. You really want to get a hand on that, early on in your career so you can understand, obviously the different tracks, but also what's required for promotion along those tracks so that when you're filling out your grid and understanding your priorities, you really know what you need to achieve in each of those domains depending on the track that you choose. And then similarly for tenure, there's criteria for achieving tenure. And so you want to make sure that you are aware of that based upon the institution that you're in. And then, very importantly, you need to discuss that with your department chair and make sure they're on the same page as you. The last thing you want to do is go along 4 or 5 years, assuming that you're doing everything you're supposed to and finding out, at 5 years when you want to go up for promotion to associate that you've missed criteria that are essential, for your promotion. And another sort of neutral party is the faculty affairs dean. And so I actually refer a lot of my faculty, and I use my faculty affairs dean all the time, to run CVs by her so that she can help, guide me and guide our faculty into when they're ready to be promoted and sometimes what's missing, especially if people kind of are on the cusp. So don't think that, there's a lot of unconscious bias that goes into promotion. I'll just say that. And so you really, really want to make sure that you are very much aware at the start of your career, the objective things, and sometimes you need to push for those things. And so having the department chair and faculty affairs dean kind of in your corner, helping guide you and advise you all along the way, I think will help prevent, a situation where, again, you've gone along for years and then all of a sudden you find out that there's another carrot that you were supposed to achieve that you never knew about. Next slide. And so this is sort of a reiteration a bit of the kind of the grid that we were talking about. I think once you kind of fill out your grid and understand what percentage of time that you really want to spend in each of the domains, that's going to help you, again, narrow down your track. One thing that's important to note is in almost all tracks, there's an expectation that you do some form of all three, teaching, service, and research. But it's really the distribution of how you balance that. So a research, tenured track, you're going to be spending the bulk of your time in research, and you're going to need to get grant support to fund that time. Versus clinical service, where the bulk of your time is spent clinically, but not all of your time. Usually there's some research and some education component to that too. So it's not that you're going to do one in the exclusion of all the other. It's just going to be, how do you want to spend your time proportionally? Next slide. So we have the second case, which is, what if you do start down a track and you do realize, several years in that you're not getting anywhere, How do you change tracks? When is the right time to think about changing tracks, and kind of what are your options? And that's, I think, an important reason to know when you're starting a position or moving institutions that the tracks that are available to you. Because again, up until a couple of years ago, we didn't even have a master clinician track. And when I was at Hopkins, that was also new as well. So some institutions may not even have a master clinician track, and you want to be aware of that, for when you're deciding on your position. So I can read this case quickly. Basically, Jane began an academic career as a faculty member on a faculty track about 15 years ago. She completed her fellowship at a large academic center, started her faculty position on a non-tenured academic track that was focused on clinical scholarship, so with a research emphasis. And over the course of 15 years, her career changed. She developed a really robust clinical program that specializes in a particular technique and recruits patients from, all over the region. But she really only published in that time period about 15 articles, none really, maybe 1 or 2 as first author, most as a middle author. She's been teaching faculty. She's been serving as an educator, was also a medical student director. So again, because she was on the clinical scholar track, she had not achieved the necessary criteria to get promoted to associate, on that particular track. And so she's still at the rank of assistant professor, 15 years into her career. So, the first question, and in the interest of time, just to leave room for the audience questions, I'm going to kind of run through these a little bit. But, what are Jane's goals and how do we address them? So, I think before we make an assumption, that Jane should switch track, obviously that's where we're going with this case, but, what are her goals? It was, it's really interesting. I mean, in conversing with a faculty, one of my faculty, their goal wasn't to get promoted. They wanted to be a faculty member and they really didn't care whether they were assistant, associate, or professor. Now, I will tell you that usually has salary implications. And so that's something that you also want to consider. Usually when you go up in rank, you also go up in salary. But that's something that, that an individual should have in discussion with their department head or dean. So, Jane's goals in particular happened to be that she did want to get promoted. And so how do we address that? Well, do we think she can achieve her goals on the current track? She's a clinician scholar. The bulk of her time is spent in clinical service with very little time spent in research. And so if we go back maybe a slide or two, Victor, to that distribution. Yep. So would a research track really be appropriate for her based upon her distribution of jobs? Or would the clinical service track be more appropriate based upon how she spends her time and what her passion is? We can go back to the case. So again, is the academic track, the research track, really the right track? And how does she assess this? Well, I think, again, that's where the grid and kind of the proportionality really comes into play. I mean, I think just looking at the way she spends her time and the proportion to which she spends her time, it becomes kind of more obvious that, maybe a clinical track is more appropriate, for this particular faculty member. And she can still be faculty, still participate in the tripartite mission, but with a different emphasis in terms of her track. Next slide. So why would you change tracks? Well, you're not the same person, in 15 years that you start out as sometimes. Sometimes you are and your interests stay the same, but sometimes your life changes or it becomes more apparent to you where your passion lies. And so, that is just something that I think you have to think about, over time, and who knows what will happen, in the future. But I think having that knowledge that you don't have to just stay, on one track for the rest of your career is important. And sometimes it's a matter of, what you signed up for and what actually happens, over time. And so sometimes it just, you sort of find yourself more and more moving towards, one part of that mission versus another. And again, maybe you discover a passion that you didn't realize you had, or over time that just becomes more of an emphasis. And that's a reason to sort of reconsider. So when is a good time to think about that? Reappointment times or annual reviews are a really good time to talk about that. Again, with your department chair, when you're reassessing year to year your goals, where you are, where you've been, where you want to go. And certainly before tenure evaluation. If you're going up for tenure and you've got a clock, that's part of what you want to be, thinking about. If you're at, year 5 and it's a 7-year clock, and you're not any closer to getting external grant funding, then, you really want to think about, is it the right track for you or not? And then how do you do it? Again, discussing with mentors, discussing with your department head, division directors, deans, everyone is really there to try to help guide you. You don't have to figure it out alone. It's just helpful at least to go into those meetings, kind of knowing what you want and knowing what's important to you. I think that's what's most important for a mentor to help guide you. And then lastly, switching tracks generally requires approvals. And so, you want to make sure that you have sort of all your ducks in a row if you're going to go down that pathway. Next slide. I think that might be the last slide. Yeah. So wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions.
So one question that we have already in chat is from Naomi, and this is, does achievement of tenure always equal being a full professor?
So no, it does not. So you can be a full professor on a non-tenure track or a full professor on a tenure track. And in fact, some institutions, you're tenured at associate professor level. So that's why you really need to know the kind of the criteria, at your institution to know, is that there's a non-tenure and tenure track, where you would fall, and then knowing at what rank you achieve tenure. And Oliver or Ray, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add to that as well.
No, I would agree. I would just also say that, I think it's pretty common that that in many institutions, your promotion from assistant to associate and your tenure evaluation occur at the same time. And so you get approved as being tenured and you get approved to associate. And so that's an initial really high bar, and something to think about in those scenarios, though, is for people who don't stay motivated, even though they're tenured and they've sort of done all that work to get tenured, sometimes they still get stuck at the associate professor level for many, many, many years because they don't go to the next step to sort of be internationally recognized in their field or, have even, more sort of important research and scholarship.
All the questions in the chat, probably. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Yeah.
Well, there's actually switch from academic. I would say it's teaching curriculum to operations. That seems like a big jump. Did she require training to be able to make that jump?
Dr. Terzakis, this was specifically for you, and this is in terms of your kind of track jump that you went through, and in regards to any unique training you might have had to go through to kind of make that jump that you went through.
Sure. So I guess I should clarify. I didn't change tracks. I held sort of different positions through my career, but I've been pretty consistently on kind of that research tenure track. But within that, the emphasis that I've sort of placed over the years did change. So I've always done research as a primary percentage of my time, clinic and educator, but I held different roles within each of those over my career. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that just because you're a research track doesn't mean you're not a clinician or an educator. I think that that's something really important to think about. So I've always been technically research track, but I knew that I wanted to sort of, be more administrative over time. I was interested in becoming a chair, and I felt that to do that, having experience in all three domains so I could be a good mentor would be really beneficial. But where I weighted my time, research was always primary, but other things would kind of ebb and flow over the course of the 15 years. Depending on where I was in my career and where sort of my passions lie. So again, you don't have to be stagnant. You can develop different skill sets. You just have to always keep in mind, what you're being judged by ultimately on your track. And the case that I specifically designated was a faculty that I did know who, did end up truly switching tracks because they were just never going to go, back to reproportionalize their time.
We have one more question, I think.
I just have two quick questions. One is, if you're going from instructor to assistant, and at your institution, that promotion doesn't go before the full APT committee, how do you navigate what the expectations are? Because it's usually at the discretion of the dean, at the discretion of the chair. How do you navigate what those expectations are to go through that promotion? And then the second question is, when going from more of a research or an educator track to a clinician track, I've actually been advised several times that may not be the best for some faculty because you often lose some benefits when you go to a clinician track, and how to navigate that.
Dr. Perez, it looked like you had an immediate response to that second question. I don't know if you want to tackle the second part first.
Okay.
Can you quickly rephrase the question so we can hear it?
The first question briefly was in going from instructor to assistant, how do you navigate that process since it's not usually before the full board and it's just a smaller conversation. And then the second part was, I'm going to get this backwards. It's making a difference.
Going to like a clinical track. I've been advised that sometimes that's not the best,
Yeah.
but they can lose some benefits.
So that you can lose benefits when you move to a clinical track and how to maybe navigate that risk.
Okay, in the second question, you need to go back to the self-assessment. You need to go to the grid of priorities, and if salary is very important for you, in the new track, you will lose some benefits. That's a non-negotiable. So you need to refrain and reassess yourself in that moment, because as Stephanie mentioned, we are not the same person every year. We can change tracks because we need to be certain what we want.
I would just add, if I can just add to that, it is something to think about when you change tracks, is that in many institutions, there are other classes of faculty besides tenure and non-tenure. And some institutions, you have certain governance rights, and it could impact your title and other things depending on what kind of a faculty member you are. So, you know, for example, if you switch to a purely clinical track, you may end up with a clinical modifier on your title. So you're no longer associate professor, but clinical associate professor. And by virtue of being clinical associate professor, that tells the world that you're a different type of faculty member that's clinically focused. Some people believe that may be a little prestigious. In some institutions, it may mean that you're not a regular faculty member with certain governance rights and like your faculty assembly and some of that other stuff. So there are other implications around track switching besides just lining up them with your interests. And so it is something else to think about. In my institution, if you have a modifier on your title like clinical, you're not considered a regular faculty member. And one of the benefits as a regular faculty member is tuition benefits for you and your family members. So if you switch tracks to a clinical track and you had that clinical modifier, you could lose like tangible benefits. And so there are other things, and it's all very local. So you really have to look at your own faculty handbook and discuss it carefully with your dean and your chair about what the implications are of changing tracks.
Yeah, I want to make one comment to that too. You know, we have two clinical tracks at University of Minnesota. We have a clinical track that is a faculty track where you don't change your benefits, and we have a clinical staff member who is an adjunct faculty, who is like the clinical associate professor that Ray was just mentioning. So even saying clinical track could mean different things. And so again, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you're a faculty member that just happens to be on a clinician track. But if you're jumping off the faculty tracks, onto a pure clinical position, then that, I think, can certainly change things. So again, we're all emphasizing, I think, the same thing, which is we really have to know the institutional specific requirements for that.
Great. Well, thank you. In the interest of time, we're going to have to close the session now, but thank all of our speakers, virtual and in person. And as a reminder, the sessions today are all recorded, so the resources will become available. And the next session starts in about 11 minutes.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.